messing with somebody else's car seat when you're driving.
Okay, we are live. I'm just going to go back and check to see if we have a name there. And we do not. Okay. So, Bob?
Okay, I'll call the meeting to order. So could we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Scott?
Yes.
Harrison?
Present?
Roberts? Okay. Kultys?
Yes, here.
Those are the only members, so we're good.
Okay, so we've got some guests and visitors. Shall we introduce them?
Kevin, I think that's you, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Nelke from Gabriel Smith & Company.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
Any public comments?
Oh, I have to go ask for those. 1 second. I'm the only one watching, so I would say no, we don't have any public comments. I'll plug it in here though, and if something comes up, I'll make sure that I bring it up at the near the end of your meeting.
Okay, so no public comments. We'll move on to approval of the minutes from April 28th of 2020.
Mr. Vice Chair, this is Commissioner Scott. Make a motion to approve those minutes as written.
Okay, can we have a second?
Bob?
Only finance votes on this, so Bob, you would need to second that if you're so inclined.
I'm so inclined, so I'll support the motion. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye.
Aye. Do we need a
Opposed,
roll
same
call
sign.
vote on that? Because we're virtual, or can we just do the ayes?
Since there's no public watching, we can just do the ayes and there's only 2 of you.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe better hurry. We're going to be done here. So,
Yeah, maybe we better hurry.
is there any old business for us to consider?
There is none.
Okay, we'll move on to new business. So we've got a presentation about the actuarial valuation of the pensions. So there we go. Let's roll.
All right, that's me. Thanks for having me again. Hope everyone can stay safe and healthy. If you can't hear me or if you have any questions, feel free at any time to interrupt me. But I was going to start on page A2 of the 2019 valuation. So on page A2, we have the contribution rates for the fiscal year beginning January 1st, 2021. And just as a reminder, the contribution rates are broken down between the normal costs and the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So the top part is for the normal cost, which is essentially for the additional year of service that everybody accrued, that all members accrued. And then the unfunded piece is the amount that's due each year in the amortization payment to pay off the unfunded. So this page shows the contribution rates for each group as well as the total. So the total contribution rate for this year is 17.7%. And then one of the other things I like to point out for this page is that the comment on the bottom of page A2 says that the unfunded liability is amortized over a closed period of 26 years, and which is consistent because last year was 27. We did make one change to that, which I'll get into it a little bit later. But essentially, in the future, we had said that once it got to be 20 years, that it was going to go to an open period. And this year, starting with this valuation, we said once we hit 20, we're going to continue to be closed. So for the results for this valuation, there is no effect. It doesn't matter until we get to 20 years, but that is something that we decided to change for this valuation. So the next page, page A2, or I'm sorry, A3, shows the dollar contributions broken down per group and the total. So the total contribution, the total dollar contribution based on projected payroll is $8.7 million for the total group. So if you're looking for the dollar contribution or the percent of payroll contribution for this year, these are the two pages that I would recommend referring to. So next, I'm going to jump to page A7. And on page A7, we have a comparative statement that shows the year-over-year contributions, the total dollar contribution and the contribution rates broken down per group. And this page is useful if you want to see how the rates have changed over the years in comparison to last year, for example. So the bottom two rows are new rows for this year. The very bottom row is the total results for this year. And then the second to last row shows the results based on before we did any assumption changes. So the second to last row, the 2021, is a good comparison to last year's because we would expect them to be relatively the same before you take into account gains and losses and that sort of thing. So for example, in the third to last row, the 2020, and then the valuation date 2018, that shows the rates from last year. So you can see that the rates did go up a little bit for each group except for the sheriff's group. And that reflects the experience for the year that's separate from the assumption changes we made. And I'll get into the experience in a minute when we change pages. But if you're looking to reference the year over year comparison, then I would look at those three rows to kind of show you what happened. If we're okay with that, then I'll go to page A8. And this is our comments page where we kind of attempt to say everything that happened throughout the year. Obviously, you know, it's easier to look at numbers, but this is something that it's important to read through. You know, in our whole report, if you only read one page or a couple pages, I would recommend reading these because they kind of outlines, like I said, what happened for the year. So for the first paragraph, we talk about experience. And this is everything that happened before we changed assumptions, before we made any actuarial changes. So overall, we had a loss for the year, and the loss was for all four groups, essentially, and as well as in total. And the loss had to do with primarily the things in the bullet points there, which is the lower than expected investment rate of return, more retirements than expected, higher benefits paid to new retirees, which is essentially saying people had a higher average salary than we expected. So when they retired, their benefits were slightly higher than what we had expected. And then a couple other data changes, basically. We had some of the AFSCME group transferred to the general group. And since they have, I think, slightly better benefits, there was a slight loss there. And then the last bullet point is we had a couple of deferred retirements that we didn't have in the data from the prior year. So when we added those, that created a small loss. So when looking at the overall experience, the loss we had was slightly offset by some gains. And the gains had to do with slightly less than projected pay increases, as well as slightly higher retiree mortality. And so those two things combined created the overall loss for the system. Hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. If not, feel free to interrupt me or ask questions here.
So Kevin, I'm relatively new to the pension board. So you're basing the returns on the calendar year 18 then?
19 actually, yes.
19. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And what I was going to do is talk a little bit more about the funding value of assets that we use. because we don't take the straight market value as of 2019. We smooth in the gains or losses over a period of 4 or 5 years. So I was going to talk about that just as a reminder a little bit later if we have time. But that's where we get that from. So after we look at the experience, we say, okay, what were the actuarial assumptions that we changed? And for this valuation, we lowered the investment return assumption from 7.5 to 7.25. We lowered the wage inflation assumption from 3.25 to 3%. And then there's the bullet point there talking about the amortization period that I mentioned earlier and how we are closing it permanently, even once we get to 20 years. And that has no effect on this year's results or contribution because we're essentially not there yet. But the reason that we pushed for that is for essentially GASB purposes, which is, for reporting, which is slightly a different reason. So the overall effect of that is that it increased the required contribution and lowered the funded status. So the next section just talks briefly about the changes in plan provisions. I think this plan, it typically has minor changes almost every year. The two things where we combined the Teamster group with the general courthouse group, and then the courthouse elected group now receives the non-reduced benefit that they essentially are paying for through increased member contributions. So the changes in plan provisions was relatively small, especially when compared to the assumption changes or the experience, but it's worth noting, of course, nonetheless. So the paragraph after that talks about the valuation assets, which I briefly mentioned that we don't use the straight market value of assets as of December 31st, 2019. We smooth in the gains or losses over a period of 5 years. So even though we had a good market return this year, I think the plan's market return was 18% or something like that. Because we're smoothing in losses from other years, this year we're reflecting a loss in regards to the investment return. The last paragraph just briefly talks about the experience study that we're doing, that we were approved to do we do it every 5 years. And it's just a reminder, we look at the investment return assumption, we look at mortality, and we look at the demographic assumptions we use for retirement patterns and withdrawal patterns and that sort of thing. So once we have that done, we'll submit it to you and we can present it if you wish, but that would be for the 2020 valuation. If there are no questions on that page, then I'll go to page A9, just the next page. And the only thing I really wanted to point out on this page was just the PA 202 disclosure on this page. So if you're looking for the results that you would report under PA 202, this would be the table to refer to because we had to use slightly different assumptions based on the So the state uses 7% investment return assumption and 3.5% wage inflation, as well as a 20-year closed amortization period. So when you look at these results, these are the results that are reported for PA 202, and they're higher than what are in the valuation that you're contributing on. If there are no questions on that page, I want to briefly go to page A16. And on page A16, this is kind of how we develop the gain loss for the year, where we come up with whether we say, oh, we had a gain this year, we had a loss. And the two things I just wanted to point out real quick on this page was lines 6 and 7. So what we do is we're showing here the increase in liability due to benefit changes and the increase due to revised assumptions or methods, which is, again, line 6 and 7. So you can see on line 6, the change from benefit provisions that I spoke about the courthouse groups, that only increased liabilities by $93,000. So it had relatively small impact. The assumption changes increased liabilities by $6.2 million. And so when we go through and we say we had a loss for the year, we take that into account, but that's kind of separate. But what this page does is a good job of showing kind of the breakdown between the two, so you can see the impact of those two things. So those are the overall results. And what I would do is say, are there any questions you have regarding the pension before I switch to the results? So if there are no questions, I'll go to the health results on page A18. And this is kind of the same thing as the first.
Yeah,
page.
Kevin. Oh.
Sorry, did someone have a question?
Yeah, this is Bob Cultus.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I lost sound for about 3 minutes, and
Oh,
now I think I'm getting an echo because I had to go through the desktop. Oh, wait, let me. Hold on. That page. Oh, the first comment page. 8.8.
yes.
Sorry about the echo. Okay.
Bob, I think you're muted again. Okay, try now.
Okay. Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Oh. I didn't know you can hear through the desktop. Okay. I'm sorry. The first bullet point under experience, the lower than expected rate of investment return. Is that referring solely to the return assumption change that we made, or to more actual variation of the assets themselves?
More variation to the assets themselves.
Okay.
So for this valuation, we had assumed the investment return on an actual basis. So that includes the smooth gains and losses, which is why we have a loss for this year, because we have investment losses that outweighed the gain that we had for this year on a market value basis. Okay, if you're all set, I'll switch over to the OPEB then on page A18. So again, just like for the pension, this shows the overall results for the year, the contribution rates and dollar amounts for the fiscal year beginning January 1st. And it breaks it down by group, and it has the total of $5.2 million. So if you're looking for the total results essentially for the OPEB evaluation, then I would refer you to this page. And there's a comment on the bottom, again, just like the for pensions, saying that we amortize the unfunded liability over a period of 24 years for all groups. But I think previously we had a separate method for Riverwood. This year they're underfunded. They have a contribution amount that they need to make. So we use 24 years for them as well. And that's something that we can review if you wish. But I think that's been the practice in the past, was to essentially, for them, if they're overfunded, to amortize the liabilities in a way such that the contribution is zero, so that the negative unfunded payment essentially outweighs the normal cost, so they don't pay anything. So we use 24 years for them, just like everybody else for this year. And then page A19, the next page, will show you on a liability basis the OPEB results for this year. So the overall plan, the funded status of the plan is 46%, and then it breaks down the funded status and the liabilities by group as of 2019. So again, if you're looking for the OPEB results, then I'd refer you to this page for future reference. So if we're okay with that, then I'll go to page A21, which is essentially our comments page for the OPEB, for the health part of the valuation. And again, I would say that if you are looking to figure out what the difference is between the past valuation and this valuation, then this is the important page to read through. So again, we say that the experience was less than expected, primarily due to the investment return being less than we expected on a smooth basis. And then for health, since it has a couple extra pieces, we added a table that basically shows the breakdown of how we can separate the results for this year. So in this table, we have the prior year results in the first row, showing you what the funded status was, the accrued liability, and the dollar contribution. So if you look at the next row, the row that says plan experience, you can see that the liabilities went up, the dollar contribution went up to indicate that we had a loss that we're reflecting for this year. So for the OPEB, as a reminder, how we value this is we take all of the premium rate information for covered members and their claims for the year, and our health actuary puts together a premium rate that we essentially apply for the valuation in order to value everybody that's covered by the OPEB plan. So by setting these new premiums for this year, row 3 shows an increase in the funded status. So what that means is the premiums that we're using, the premiums that we got from your data basically, were lower than expected, which is a good thing. So the costs were less than we expected. So just looking at that piece, you can see that the dollar contribution went down essentially, just looking at that piece by itself. And so the fourth row talks about, it says resetting the healthcare trend. And what that does is we have a trend, like an inflation assumption that we apply to the OPEB liabilities each year because health costs increase every single year. And what our practice is to reset that trend every year, basically look at what the rate is and if it's reasonable. Because in the short term, we expect costs to increase, rather dramatically. Usually we assume 7 or 8, sometimes 9% an increase, next year, and then 8% the following year, 7%, so on. And the idea is that eventually you'll get down to a lower trend long term. And so that has to do with the fact that eventually, theoretically, costs cannot spiral out of control. You can't have health costs increasing forever and ever and ever. Otherwise, it would consume the United States GDP. So what this assumption, every time we reset it, it's always going to increase the liabilities, essentially. And this is something that is normal that we do for every valuation that we do for every client. And it's part of how, healthcare costs essentially work in the United States. That may be more than you needed to know, but in case it comes up, that's kind of where that's going. And so the last row in that table says changes in actuarial assumptions and methods. Those are the final results, and that reflects the change in the investment return assumption, essentially. So the other comments on this page, I kind of already talked about the paragraph that says changes in assumptions and methods and the Riverwood amortization period. The only other thing I wanted to point out was that in the past, we had a paragraph on this page that talked about the expected employer premiums paid and the implicit subsidy. And so when I looked at this year, I kind of decided that it could be reworded so that it make a little bit more sense. So in the second paragraph under the table, we're showing you the expected employer portion of the claims and premiums as $4.7 million. And then the breakdown between what we think the premiums and the claims would be. And I think that the county uses that for budgeting purposes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you'd said in the past was the policy was that the premiums and the claims get paid out of the general fund, and then the OPEB reimburses the general fund, essentially. So that's what those numbers are used for. I think we had a question about that last year, which is why I'm pointing it out. So if you need any more information about that, feel free to ask. So in general, that's the overview of the valuation. I kind of wanted to stop there to see if there's any questions. But essentially, that's all I had for my part of the presentation.
Are there any questions for Kevin? No, it doesn't. It sounds like you're getting out pretty easy, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean that's good. So you're saying I should sign off before somebody thinks of a question?
That'd be my plan. So, and if there's no other questions, we'll excuse Kevin. Annette, do we take action on the evaluation report then?
No, it's just simply that you received it.
Okay. Shelley, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because you're really more involved in this. Is this where you thought we would be at this time?
At this stage, I would say so, being new coming into this, I would say at this point, yes, I think we're okay.
Okay. And how about Shelley Jasper?
Yeah, I mean, you have.
I just value your opinions on this,
Yeah, if you dig into the report, while we had a net loss this year, that's because we smooth over 5 years and we're still smoothing some previous year's losses. Our gain for this year alone, just in investments, I think Kevin said was like 18%. So Russell is doing a good job investing, or did a good job investing for that prior calendar year. It's just the amount of things that we have to bring in from the previous 4 years that caused the loss. So I believe we're still well positioned.
Okay, and that's why I wanted to ask you that, because I've only been involved in finance now for the last 2 years, so I'm relying heavily on, especially you, Shelley, for that. And thank you very much for that.
One thing I did want to add is that this report does not reflect anything regards to COVID-19 and the financial effects of it. So our hope for you guys, since you're a calendar year, is that you, by the 2020 valuation, hoping to see the economy go back to normal, or more so than it is now. But just keep that in mind, that for the 2020 valuation, we'll do our best to communicate to you what, if we see anything that is dramatically, an issue that we want to talk about. But of course, this valuation was done before that really hit.
You expect the mortality of some of the more senior members of the population, maybe of our pool, affecting valuations down the road?
We think in the short term, yes. The more concerning aspect is financial results. I think the mortality gains in the short term would lower liabilities, but since the market hasn't recovered, we would be more concerned that the financial results would be a lot lower than expected. But it's still really hard to tell.
Okay, any other questions for Kevin?
If you think of anything, please feel free to reach out at any time, email or call.
Okay, do we have any other business to take care of?
None that I'm aware of. I don't believe we have anything scheduled for the next meeting, but we can probably make a decision whether we need to have that or not a little bit closer to the actual meeting date, which is always the 4th Thursday of the month.
Okay, so that'd be July 23rd.
Right, I think.
Okay, if there's no other business, then we'll adjourn the meeting. And thank everyone for attending and participating. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.